So what do you do with hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen assets that belong to a major world power? Well, the EU is grappling with that exact question right now. And according to our source material, the answer they're leaning towards could fundamentally rewrite the rules of global finance. Let's really get into this controversial plan.
And this really gets to the heart of the issue, doesn't it? The word frozen makes you think of something temporary, a hold that will eventually be lifted. But what if that's not the plan at all? What if frozen is actually a step towards gone for good? The EU is apparently looking at a strategy that could make this freeze permanent. And that changes everything.
Okay, so how would they even pull this off? It's not as simple as just saying we're keeping it. The source material walks us through a very specific mechanism the EU is reportedly considering to lock these assets up for good. Let's break down how it would actually work.
Right, so here's the crucial maneuver. Currently, sanctions, including this asset freeze, have to be renewed every 6 months. That gives countries like Hungary a regular veto. This new plan, though, it flips the script entirely. It would require a unanimous vote to unfreeze the assets. And getting all member states to agree on that, well, that's seen as basically impossible.
Now, you might think this is a done deal, but it's really far from a slam dunk. As our source material points out, this idea is running into a huge wave of opposition from some of the most powerful financial players on the planet.
And what's so interesting here is who is pushing back. We're not just talking about the usual political opponents. We're talking about the European Central Bank, the IMF, the very institutions designed to keep the financial system stable. Even key allies like the US and Japan are, according to the source, waving some pretty big red flags. And listen to the language being used. The source highlights this quote from the Prime Minister of Belgium, the very country that hosts the EU's main institutions, calling the plan pretty much theft. That's incredibly strong, and it just goes to show you how deep the divisions are, even right at the heart of the EU.
This leads us to a really critical legal argument that the source material lays out. It all boils down to a fundamental difference. The difference between temporarily freezing something and permanently taking it away.
In this little chart illustrates it perfectly. When you freeze an asset, it's a temporary hold. Ownership is still intact. The expectation is that it'll be returned. But when you confiscate it, that's a permanent seizure. You're denying ownership, and there's zero expectation of return. The source argues that by making the freeze permanent, the EU isn't freezing anymore, it's confiscating. And that's a whole different legal ballgame.
So, to get this done, the source claims the EU is reaching for its emergency powers. This would be a way to just steamroll Hungary's veto and even ignore international treaties. The analysis is pretty stark here. It describes this as turning the EU into a lawless institution that's basically tearing up its own founding documents.
The source uses this really powerful analogy to drive the point home. If you say you'll return the assets, but only in exchange for reparations, well, that doesn't make the alleged theft any better. In fact, it makes it worse. It turns the whole situation into something that looks a lot like holding property for ransom.
Okay, so this is where the analysis takes a fascinating strategic twist. What if this entire situation is actually a trap? And what if it's a trap that Russia wants the EU to walk right into?
The thinking, according to this analysis, is that from Moscow's perspective, these assets are already gone. They've essentially written them off. The calculation is that no matter what legal games are played, that money is never coming back. So, if the money isn't the main concern, what is?
Well, the bigger prize, the source says, is strategic. Russia allegedly believes that if the EU goes ahead with this, it will do catastrophic damage to its own financial credibility on the world stage. And that is a long-term strategic win that is worth far more than a few $100 billion. And what would that fallout look like? Well, the source claims it could be incredibly severe. It would send a signal to countries like Saudi Arabia and other major global investors that Europe is not a safe place to park their capital. This could push them to speed up the development of other financial systems like BRICS, the bloc with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And ultimately, that could seriously damage the euro's standing in the world. All right, now we get to the final and maybe the most provocative argument in this whole analysis. How this big international financial chess move could eventually lead to a direct tax on EU citizens.
The source lays out this potential chain of events. Step 1, the EU makes member states financially liable for any losses from this move. Then, step 2, to cover those huge potential losses, the EU realizes it needs its own independent stream of income. And that leads directly to step 3, a brand new EU-wide tax.
And this first step, forcing liabilities onto member states against their will, is described as being like a forced loan.
The source is quick to point out that this is an extreme move, something that historically you'd only see from a nation in an all-out war. It really blurs the lines of what the EU is and what it has the power to do.
Okay, so we've walked through the legal arguments, the huge international pushback, and this idea of a strategic trap. So what's the big takeaway? What's the central argument this analysis is trying to make? Let's connect all the dots.
So, in a nutshell, the argument is this: a single decision to permanently take these Russian assets could kick off a chain reaction it can't control. First, it blows a hole in the EU's own legal foundation. Then it springs a strategic trap that hurts its financial reputation. And the final domino to fall could be the creation of a centralized EU power of direct taxation.
And so, this entire analysis really leaves us with one fundamental question. It's not just about money or geopolitics, it's about the rule of law itself. When an institution that was built on laws decides to break its own rules, what happens next? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.